Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on Eldrad Ulthran, Farseer of Ulthwé, gradually crystallizing badass who is perhaps the most famous named character in the entire Eldari line. Now, in these unit focus videos, I talk about what the unit is, its role on the table, obstacles to using it effectively, and then how to play around those and get the most out of the unit. If I'm totally honest, Eldrad was not anywhere near first in the queue a week ago for the next unit focus video, but then something crazy happened. We got the balance data slate last Tuesday, and Fate dice, for those, just in case anybody out there missed it, our starting number of Fate dice went from 12 to 6. Ooh. Which is slightly less than you probably want and need, and Eldrad is a way to solve that, because including Eldrad in your list gives you 3 additional Fate dice, and while that is not a sufficient reason in and of itself to include Eldrad, it's certainly a reason to consider him. Obviously, Guardian Defenders can also get you Fate dice. There are a couple of other ways, but either Guardian Defenders or Eldrad are probably the most reliable, and he's the only one that gives them to you at the start of the game. So even though Eldrad has been riding the bench for pretty much all of 10th edition, now we're taking him seriously as a possible include. He's still far from being an auto include, but a lot of people are thinking about whether or not he might have a place in lists now, and so I wanted to spend some time unpacking that. I've been thinking about it a lot. So let's start by talking about what Eldrad is in terms of his role on the table and what he can do for you. So beyond the fact that he just gives you 3 extra Fate dice because he can see the future and he knows all sorts of things about it, Eldrad is essentially a midfield battle commander. Pretty much, he's got some very powerful abilities, but they for the most part all have an 18-inch range, and so he needs to be more or less, because a lot of these are abilities that target an opponent, he needs to be more or less in the middle of the field. That's where he wants to play. So these days, foot farseers are typically like a backline unit, and Eldrad is a foot farseer who's like a midfield unit, and he hands out buffs. He notably does 3 things. One of those things is he gives you Fate dice. Another thing is he has Doom. This is where Doom went. Doom now gives, you roll a d6. It's got to be a unit that you have line of sight on. If you're Eldrad within 18 inches, you roll a d6, and as long as you don't roll a 1, Eldar units have +1 to wound that unit when they attack it. That's very powerful. So he enhances damage output quite considerably into a single unit. And then the third thing he does is Mind War. You might remember the old Mind War psychic power is now Eldrad's ranged attack. It is a one-shot, like, anti-character assassination attack that, with the combination of Fate dice and a failed armor save by your opponent, can do some pretty serious damage to an enemy character. And then there's something else that he does for you, which is kind of subtle, and it's a trick, and I'm just going to give it away now so nobody has to wait in case you're a busy horse dentist with somewhere to be. Eldrad, weirdly, as long as you have another foot farseer in your list, Eldrad, weirdly, kind of has the Branching Fates farseer psychic power. Right? So Branching Fates is that farseer power that lets you treat a Fate die as any Fate die as a 6 for a model within 12 inches of the farseer. But the way it's actually phrased on the farseer data card is once per turn when you use a Fate dice to substitute a roll made for a model or a unit within 12 inches of a farseer model. Not this farseer model, a farseer model. It means that you can only do it once per player turn, regardless of the number of farseers that you have. But it means that you can pick a model within 12 inches of any farseer. So if you have this backline farseer, and then you have Eldrad up towards the midfield, you can pick a unit within 12 inches of Eldrad. And that's actually really useful for reasons that I'll get into in a moment. So this is Eldrad in a nutshell, right? He's giving you 3 additional Fate dice. He's giving you the ability to reroll wound rolls against a unit within 12 inches. He has a powerful psychic attack that is arguably the least important thing that he does. It will only occasionally work. And then also he extends your range essentially for Branching Fates, which is actually really good. Again, for reasons we'll get into in just a moment. We'll just briefly go over the rest of the data card. He moves 7 inches. He's toughness 4. Eldred is historically a little tougher than other Farseers, which is kind of fun. He's got 5 wounds, 4 up invulnerable save, standard, more or less standard durability, slightly more durable. His ranged weapon, that Mind War attack, is 18 inches, 1 shot, hits on 2s, strength 5, -2 d6 damage with anti-character 4+. So if you're up, this would only come up against a character who is greater than toughness 5, but characters that are also monsters, like sometimes this happens. And then he has a decent melee weapon, a little bit better than standard, the Staff of Ulthran. He's got 3 attacks with it, hitting on 2s, strength 5, anti-infantry 2+. That's good. So it's typically going to probably hit on 2s and wound on 2s, and then -1 AP flat 2 damage. So definitely not a combat monster, but if a couple of Space Marines charge him, maybe he'll kill one. Maybe he'll kill both. Who knows? I already mentioned the Doom power, and then he's a leader. He can lead Guardian Defenders, Storm Guardians, or a Warlock Conclave. And that is Eldred in a nutshell. So at 110 points, Eldred is kind of an interesting tool because no single thing that he does merits his point cost. 3 additional fate dice in an economy where suddenly we don't have enough necessarily is very good. It is objectively very good. It is not 110 points good. Doom is very good. +1 to wound is extremely powerful. It's extremely powerful, especially for units, volume of fire units that maybe can't make use of our detachment bonus. So for something like a Bright Lance, where you're basically getting, if a unit has 1 or 2 Bright Lances, and it's rerolling a hit and rerolling a wound, generally you're going to get your wounds. I mean, not that it can't help to have +1 to wound with a Bright Lance against something really tough, but like in general, the models that are going to benefit the most from this are models that have a higher volume of fire, but might frequently find themselves in situations where against pretty tough targets, they're wounding on 5s, or even going to 3s. Going to 2s instead of 3s is good. Like, this is a good damage multiplier, especially for volume of attacks. Banshees, he's really, really good for buffing Banshees, because Banshees don't have very impressive strength at 4, but they have really good AP at -3. And so this kind of like gets Banshees there. Not that I'm saying you should suddenly put Banshees in all your lists, but Doom is a pretty powerful damage multiplier into a single target. But given that we already have the detachment bonus and we're already really good at target elimination, it's definitely on its own not worth 110 points. Definitely not. Mind War. Mind War is a really powerful tool for character assassination, and it's also just a good shooting attack. That d6 damage with a fate die, because Eldred is always within 12 inches of himself, you can use any fate die to just make that do flat 6 damage. That's pretty cool, but also definitely not a reason to pay 110 points. And while having the ability to put branching fates on units further forward out of range of your backline Farseer, it's not something that you pay 110 points for. So in order to justify Eldred in your list, you need to be using him to do at least 3 of the things that well, I said initially 3, but it's actually, he has 3 things on his data sheet, and then he can also do branching fates. I think you have to be making use of 3 or 4 of those for him to be a credible include at all. And even then, it's like, there's a real question whether or not you really want to drop 110 points on this guy. Because these days, the way the rules for Fate Dice have changed, you probably really do need that other Farseer. And if you have 190 points into Farseers, well, that's like 10% of your list. So if you are going to include Eldred, here's how I think that you should think about it. This is certainly how I'm going to be thinking about using him. First off, he needs to be positioned, as I said, forward of your deployment zone into the midfield in a place where that 18-inch range is going to be meaningful. Now, one obstacle to making this work effectively is that Eldred is quite fragile. You really don't want, I mean, toughness 4 is better than the typical elf toughness 3, but it's not like he's super hard to kill. So And he's got to be pretty close to the enemy. This is one of the obstacles to using him effectively. In practice, here's what this means. If you are running Eldrad in your list, then you must also be running a powerful bully unit to be hovering in front of him, kind of like 9, 10, 11 inches out, maybe exactly 12 inches out, or more out than that. But I think within a foot is good, in part because it lets your bully unit use branching fates. And that bully unit is probably going to be the Avatar of Khaine. I think that's the most obvious pick. Or, arguably, either Wraith Guard or Wraith Blades. Probably a big unit, probably 10. Also, Eldred needs to be completely out of line of sight. Now, with the amount of terrain on the table in 10th edition, that should be pretty easy. There's a lot of midfield terrain. There are two ways to put Eldred out of line of sight, more or less in the midfield. One is to stick him behind a line of sight blocking ruin. Woo! The other option is to put him in a line of sight blocking ruin, but he's a relatively small model. Just don't put him by a window. A lot of if you're playing with official GW terrain, or really any terrain, a lot of it is sufficiently opaque that it will block true line of sight for a single infantry model. Now, this combination of Eldred and a bully unit to get out in front of him and protect him is actually, it just has nice natural synergy. So, for example, the Avatar of Khaine is probably the single best unit in the entire game of 40k to use for Overwatch Fire, because the Wailing Doom hits incredibly hard, and if it hits because you only hit on 6s, right? With Overwatch Fire, it will always trigger its sustained hits D3, and that's just like that's a crazy amount of firepower. And because Eldred can use Branching Fates, Eldred can guarantee that your Avatar of Khaine hits with Overwatch Fire, even when it's too far away from your regular Foot Farseer, in order to guarantee the 6. And it used to be the case before we had like fewer fate dice. Generally, you could rely on having like at least 1 or 2 6s. Statistically, with 12 dice, you would get 2. So turn 1, if your Avatar has the opportunity to do Overwatch, it's probably close enough to your Foot Farseer in the back to use a fate die. If it's not close enough on turn 2, then you could use one of your natural 6s. Well, you're now a bit less likely to have natural 6s. I mean, to be fair, with Eldred, you're half again as likely as you were with only 6 dice. But you could definitely whiff on the natural 6s, and you could also end up with only 1. And the Avatar is likely to survive for more than a single turn of Overwatch Fire. So the ability to use Eldred to guarantee that your Avatar hits with Overwatch Fire in the new economy is pretty powerful. It's also good for other stuff. You can guarantee that one of your Wraith Guard with a Wraith Cannon triggers devastating wounds. Sometimes you're going to have stuff in the midfield that really wants a 6 on like an advance move. He can guarantee that happens. Just that ability to buff your midfield units. In general for Eldar, those are going to be your bully units, which are out of range of that backline Farseer. He needs a bully unit to protect him, and then it has nice synergy with what he can do for the bully unit. So that's cool. Now there are a couple of obstacles to using both Doom and Mind War effectively. And well, there's one obstacle besides the 18-inch range. And that is that they require line of sight, which is a real bummer because Eldred is fragile AF by normal 40k Grim Darkness of the 41st Millennium standards, even if not by Elf standards. And you just can't afford to have him like step through the wall of a ruin and stand there and point at some enemy Forge Fiend and be like, "You shall die." And yes, you kill the Forge Fiend, and then your 110 point model dies with relatively little resource expenditure by your opponent. Obviously, you do not want this. That's bad. That's terrible. That's not an option. So, if you're going to run Eldred, here's the way to keep him alive. Phantasm got a big nerf, right? Which is sad. Phantasm, instead of now letting you move 7 inches, lets you move D6, which is a real problem for units. But this can still work for individual character models. So either Eldred establishes line of sight by looking through a window in a ruin, and then just phantasms out of true line of sight behind totally opaque walls in the ruin, or he steps out like 3/4 of an inch from behind a piece of terrain and uses Doom. And then at the end of your opponent's movement phase, he steps back behind the piece of terrain, and we're relying on that bully unit, the avatar, or whatever, to keep him safe. He'll also need to do this to be able to use his ranged attack, Mind War. Now, I actually, when I first looked at the Codex and I looked at Mind War, I was like, oh, sorry, Index. That kind of sucks. That's not that like a lot of us were using Mind War in the old days anyway, but 1 die, right? It's anti-character 4 up, so still against tough characters can whiff half the time with only -2 AP, so a lot of these characters are going to be saving on like a 5 up, unless they have an invuln, in which case it's a 4 up. Nevertheless, Mind War is actually pretty solid as an extra. Again, it's not like a reason to take the guy, but if your opponent is running some squad that wants to play the midfield with a pretty tough character with 5 or 6 wounds, since you've got to step out to do Doom anyway, you can also point at that character, Mind War it. You're going to hit on a 2 with 1 reroll for our detachment ability. And then you stand a pretty good chance of wounding with Strength 5. It will wound a lot of characters on a 3. And even the toughest stuff in the game, it's going to wound on a 4. And then because we have that reroll, right, for our detachment bonus, worst case scenario, if it's a character, and that's what you probably want to target, worst case scenario, I guess if you're using precision, obviously you're targeting a character. Worst case scenario, you have a much better than 50% chance of succeeding because you're gonna wound on a 4 up with a reroll. So you stand a really good chance of hitting, and you stand a really good chance of wounding. At which point, they're making an armor save at -2, even if it's a 5 up. If you do this a couple of times, you're likely to get 1 through, and then you can use a fate die to do 6 damage, and that will automatically kill a lot of characters in the game. Which is pretty powerful. And even if your opponent isn't running an important, like, I need to target you with precision character, there are a lot of character models that are just, like big combat monsters or whatever, and the ability to do like flat 6 damage to one of those is not bad. I will say that it could also be interesting to have something else in your list with precision. If you're running Eldrad, like a Death Jester can Fate's Messenger into precision and do some damage, or Illic, suddenly the ability to do like 9 damage to a squad protected character if you hit with both Illic and Eldred is pretty cool. That's pretty powerful character assassination. Mind War is not a massive asset for character assassination, in part because your opponent if your opponent has something that really needs to not die, may not oblige you by moving within 18 inches of Eldred. But I will say that since you have to move out for Doom anyway, this shooting attack is no joke, and the ability to just send it to 6 damage with a fate die, it's not nothing. It's not insignificant. That is meaningful and significant shooting that does in fact count for something. And again, with branching fates, if you are running Eldred, not only will it make your Bright Lances or your Wailing Doom or whatever even that much more likely to wound really tough stuff, but it really does open up play with some other units like Banshees that maybe struggle to have the level of target elimination that we would like them to have. And again, especially stuff with like pretty good AP. I actually think that this the Doom Power has really good synergy with Fire Dragon fusion guns, which people are already running in competitive lists because they're just really good. Fire Dragon fusion guns do a crap load of damage if you're within Melta range, and they've got great AP at -4, but they're strength 9, which is good because like a moderately tough light tank or something is probably going to be toughness 9, but a lot of stuff is above that, right? So there's a lot of stuff where your Dragon Fusion guns are only wounding on 5s, the sort of targets that they are ideal into, and then you're kind of relying on your reroll and volume of fire to do some real damage with the fusion guns. But if you have Eldred, now those are wounding on 4s. Ah, and because he's nearby them in the midfield, you could use a fate die roll of a 1 to push through a wound, or to guarantee that one of those fusion guns does, instead of d6 plus melt to 3, like flat 6 plus 3 if you're in range, or even just flat 6. It's Doom is good. It's solid. It does mean that you are battle focusing, phantasming rather, with Eldred instead of with something else, and that's a loss. So if you're going to build a list that includes Eldred, you've got to be prepared to be spending that point on Phantasm, because unless you're using his abilities, he's not worth taking, and you kind of need to have Phantasm to use his abilities. Okay, now the last consideration with Eldred is whether or not to have him lead anything at all. And this one's a bit thorny, right? On the one hand, at 110 points, when you probably already need a regular Farseer, he can't lead anything really excellent. So you might be tempted not to have him lead anything at all, and just rely on keeping him out of line of sight to keep him alive, and not worry about having some bodyguard unit. But of the units he can lead, I think at least 2 of them are worth at least thinking about. I am by no means saying that it's the best play, but there's 2 of them I think are at least worth thinking about. And then the Warlock Conclave, maybe you want to use in casual play, could be fun. I think the best candidate, the most obvious candidate, probably is Guardian Defenders. Guardian Defenders will do a couple of things for you with Eldred. One, if they start a command phase on an objective, they get you an extra fate die, right? So if you're running Eldred with Guardian Defenders and part of your goal is to get fate die, you can probably start the game with at least one of your Guardian Defenders towing your backfield objective. So instead of getting 3 additional fate die, you'll end up getting 4 if you add the one that you get in your own command phase. And then if there's a way to position Eldred in the midfield such that the Guardians can also place a midfield objective, which there often will be, right? They can get you more. They can get you more command points. And then if you give them the Bright Lance platform, which I think you should if you're going to do this, if you're planning to Phantasm anyway, when Eldred is stepping right up to the window or stepping just 3/4 of an inch to the side of the building, you can also have the Bright Lance do that. And when Eldred is firing with Mind War and doing Doom, you can also fire with the Bright Lance, which because of the detachment, you'll get it's a single Bright Lance, so you get a reroll to hit and a reroll to wound, and it does a ton of damage. And because Eldred is there with his Branching Fates ability, you can just make the Bright Lance do 8 damage to something if it goes through. It also means that if something tries to move to get a line on Eldred in the midfield behind his ruin, some fast enemy like light tank or bike or something, you can just use Overwatch on that Bright Lance and auto hit with it, and Eldred's right there, so he can make it auto hit, and it'll have full rerolls to wound, and then do a ton of damage potentially. Like, it's not bad. And then if things go reasonably well and you don't lose the midfield in the later part of the game, Eldred can just like run through the wall with the Guardians, and the Guardians can lay down some fire with their shuriken catapults and still use the Bright Lance and have OC2 on midfield objectives. Guardians aren't like an impressive combat unit, but late in the game, if they're still alive and in the midfield with volume of fire, they're not bad, especially because his Doom ability will make their shuriken catapults way better. So instead of wounding T3 light infantry on a 3, they'll wound them on 2s. They'll wound Space Marines on 3s instead of 4s. And really tough stuff that they would have wounded on 5s, now they're wounded on 4s. They have a little bit of AP. They have volume of fire. Doom has nice synergy with shuriken catapults. On the other hand, for 110 points, to add the Guardian Defenders to Eldred, who's also 110 points at 220, that's kind of a big ask. But this also means that it'll be harder for your opponent to just assassinate Eldred by getting a bead on him with, a bike unit with 3 heavy weapons in it and lighting him up, because they'll just kill Guardians. It's worth at least thinking about. The other option would of course be to run him with the Guardian Defenders, the Storm Guardians, which again is not bad. The range on the Storm Guardian fusion guns is not great, but he's got to be in the midfield anyway. So probably you will have targets for those fusion guns. And when you do your like Doom thing where you pop out and then Phantasm away, instead of poking just the Bright Lance out, you would be poking out just the fusion guns. And then if you get down to the Triarii in the late game, I guess it's sort of ironic to say down to the Triarii with Guardians, but if you get down to the Triarii in the late game, and you have to actually use your Storm Guardians for melee combat, well, the problem that Storm Guardians have is that they, even though they have a little bit of AP, they're only strength 3 with those swords. Well, Doom kind of like sort of pseudo solves that a little bit. Lastly, Storm Guardians can help you out a little by making objectives sticky. Now, sticky objectives for you new players are objectives that you continue to control even if you have no models on them, as long as the opponent doesn't control them. And in the recent rules update, it became a little bit easier to undo a sticky objective because now your opponent just has to control it at the end of any phase, not the command phase. But that's just not that likely to come up. Sticky objectives are useful. It's really nice to not have to worry about keeping models on your home objective to be able to move off with your lone operative, way leaper, or whatever and do things in the midfield. Your Storm Guardians can make your home objective sticky at the beginning of the game, which is useful, and potentially can make a midfield objective sticky too, which theoretically might matter. Between the Guardian Defenders and the Storm Guardians, I think probably with the Bright Lance, the Guardian Defenders are a little bit better, also with the extra Fate die. But if you really love Storm Guardians, this is certainly a way you could use them. Again, I don't know that it's like worth the added expense of doubling the cost of the unit. The other reason not to run Eldred with a bodyguard is with the half-inch Phantasm thing, or just getting the unit out of line of sight. It's just way harder to hide a unit of 12 models because they have the platforms too, right? It's way harder to hide a unit of 12 models than it is to hide a single character model. And so there are some advantages to running Eldred with the bodyguard, but at the level of expense that it comes with, you need to be able to sure that you need to also be sure that you're going to be able to make use of the other things that the Guardians do, including their combat prowess, like making an objective sticky and or getting an extra Fate die on turn 1 is not going to be enough. They also have to fight a little bit. Lastly, you could run Eldred with a Warlock Conclave of 2 Warlocks, which I guess would help him not be killed by indirect fire. There was a foot Warlock Conclave that appeared in a recent GT list that did really well. I'm not sold on this. So a couple of Warlocks with either Ghost Blades or a Singing Spear, two Warlocks would each have Destructor, which is like a -1 AP Flamer attack that auto hits with D6 shots. Okay, that's fine. If they were really close to the enemy, between Eldred's Mind War and their Destructors, they'd be okay. And then that whole group of Eldred and the 2 Guardians would be like a modestly okay melee unit. The problem with Warlock melee weapons is that they have no AP. So, yeah. They are multi-damage. I just don't think it's a good use of the points. But if you, for narrative reasons, if you're an Ulthway player and you want to be like, well, Eldred's here with his honor guard, his 2 psychic bros, then I think to make that vaguely worthwhile, you have to be planning to get aggressive with them on like turn 4 or 5 and have them actually fight a little, which you could do, but is certainly not the competitive move. They do make him -1 to wound, and because he's a T4 elf, I guess that's kind of good against small arms. We'll wound him on 5s, but it's certainly not going to substantially change the way you can play with him. It would allow him to be a little bit more aggressive in the late game, but it's not going to be like, ooh. Oh, and actually, and that would only matter if somebody targeted him with precision anyway, because they're the bodyguards, so they're going to die first. So they're T3, so their protectability actually only helps them, and only when a Farseer is leading the unit. So that's like super unimpressive. So that's what I've got. I think if you want to think about playing with Eldred, he does help solve the Fate dice problem. If you're going to play with him, you have to be planning to use all of his tools, or his expense is really not justifiable. And if that's what you're going to do, there's a way to do it. You know, he plays in the midfield. You've got to be prepared to use Phantasm. You need the bully unit, and you think about how it's going to synergize with your other stuff. But Doom is good. It opens up some more doors to units that might be viable. And even if you're not getting sort of creative or edgy or pseudo casual with your includes, it's also good for stuff like Fire Dragons. If you have your own ideas about how to make Eldrad viable in 10th edition, slightly competitive 40k, or even perhaps very competitive 40k, please say so in the comments below. If you just want to say hello, that would be great too. Those of you who regularly consume the content and enjoy it, I assume you've already subscribed. It would be cool if you clicked like on the video, and you may, if you're feeling particularly desirous of immersing yourself further in the elf cause, you could always become a patron at $3 a month and join on Discord and banter with me and other patrons about all sorts of goofy elf stuff and less goofy elf stuff. You also get early access to some content and the ability to consume it like a podcast, which some people really like. There are a few other benefits at the higher levels, but for the most part, those are just people being even nicer. Okay, that's what I've got. Hope to be back again next Saturday with new content. Best of luck with your pointy ears. Take care. Bye.